Again, opening day jitters over here. So, no more post-its. Name of the presentation about automating configuration and deployments. So, I don't know how y'all do stuff. I know that for many, many years when I had a deployment, I had zillions of little notes, either in Notepad, Post-its, or whatever to the side, saying okay, the day that I push this out, I'm going to do X and Y and Z. And eventually, I would have a wall of Post-its like this. This is amazing, by the way. This is a brewery in California called Modern Times, and these are all Post-its of a Michael Jackson sculpture. So honestly, this is too many Post-it notes for the kind of thing you want to do for a normal Drupal deployment. So over time, I kind of accrued various tricks and tips, and all towards the goal of being able to deploy a configuration without any manual steps. Is that possible? Pretty much. So kind of a rundown of the stuff I used to do back in the day, go through, just the kind of litany of things where you would, spend the deployment process worried about the day where you have to actually put it out into the world and deal with your clients getting angry about something not there or there. But at this point, I try to advise or try to actually live out the example of codifying everything, testing everywhere, and having it work every time, usually. And every time isn't a word. So, the methods I primarily use for a D7 in order to make it so that we don't have to do any manual deployment steps using a lot of features, and something called a deployment module. This is not my concept. It's been around for a bit, but I think it's great, and I'll be describing it and showing a live demo at the end of this. And in Drupal 8, configuration management. So show of hands on features. How many people use features?
Everybody.
What's that?
Everybody.
Yeah, I wasn't sure. Sometimes I'd be surprised. I'll deal with clients. They'll be like, I don't know what that is, or I don't use those. And configuration management in D8. Anybody using that? Everybody using that? Okay. And also, is there going to be some big questions y'all have on your mind that just kind of, no, please, yeah, just kind of, I'm wondering how this could go, because there is a lot of stuff to consider and a lot of stuff that can bite you in the butt. In that tone, what I'm not promising in this session are any silver bullets with content deployment. Content deployment, I advise using migrate or maybe feeds if you're in D7. I can't really go into depth on that because that's probably a whole different session, but if you're talking about deployment of configuration, this is what I'm going to be doing here. Won't be able to give you a lot of insight about Circle, CI, or Jenkins or anything. I can kind of tell you what to tell the DevOps. I have some experience with it too, so I can field some questions, but that's not going to be covered here. Also not promising live demos at work, because they're just going to fail, and we've all seen that happen multiple times. But straight off to Drupal 7. Again, from the show of hands, people have used features, which is great, so I won't be going too much in depth with that. I think the one tip that I have in regards to features is something that I've gone through is, I'm sorry, let me touch on this, what I'm saying here on the slide. I think if you all are using something like Git or any kind of version control system, it's great to have features to codify and track what changes are being done. Especially if you're dealing with multiple developers. I know that in many instances you'll find out that something isn't working on the site, you don't know quite why, and if everybody's diligently using features, then you can kind of see who did what. But the one thing, it really helps to have it so that when you're using features, you're doing things that content editors can't mess with or shouldn't mess with. So how many people have people doing configuration on production? Their clients do it, or people in their company do it? No one? Because that's awesome, because I envy that. A lot of the time there'll be a client who's like, I wanted to do this, so I went into the admin interface and I changed that, and all hell breaks loose. But
we have a thing that basically says if you change anything on live that's like that configuration, it all gets wiped out in the next push.
yeah, see, I love that kind of draconian attitude. That's perfect, right?
I just set up rules and block them.
What was that?
Set up rules and block them.
Yeah, no, that's another good answer too. It depends on how demanding the client is. Sometimes they're just like, I
There's
want
a
it.
module on Drupal 8 that doesn't let them click save.
Right, yeah, I've done that, yeah.
You turn that on, and you can be quite draconian about it and turn that on, but some of your clients will insist.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, I've gone around to like actually just making things hidden in the CSS, and then they'll be like unhiding it and stuff. So they're devious bastards. That's a whole other presentation. So yeah, so if all of you have used views, I mean, all of you have used features, then you kind of probably have a sense of what they're good for. It's everything that isn't content. This is not like the like set in stone like list here. I mean, this is my distinct opinion about what's good and bad, and you can make some like exceptions for things like menus, that are kind of like content but kind of aren't, depending on the situation at hand. Like if you're allowing your content people to enter in things that can become menus, it gets a little iffy. But in general, these are the kind of things you want to lock down and featureize if you can. And if everybody's used features before and knows the UI, I don't really have to get into too much detail about this. Again, I'll be showing this in the demo that I'm about to present. But I find that in my deployment process, as far as how to automate things, I lean on a lot of Drush in order to make sure things click well. And everybody familiar with Drush too? Okay, great. I love presenting in 2018. This is a wonderful thing. One thing, I don't know, I mean, this is do as I say, not as I do. With features, I find sometimes it's hard to make them atomic. In a best case scenario, you're having a feature that's a view. You're making the view of recipes. And when you featureize it, you're only like featureizing the things that are related to that view. Sometimes people either get greedy and try to featureize things with that view that are pertaining to that view, things like permissions, or using strong-arm to throw extra stuff in. I advise not to do that. I try to break it down as atomically as possible. Make it so it's like, you have permissions as their own feature, views as their own feature, context as their own feature. I'll show some of that in a bit, but I find that if you do that, you have a cleaner experience in deployment. It makes it just a lot easier when you're trying to figure out what went wrong, which you probably will have to do eventually. So I talked a bit about this before. Doing manual configuration of featureable elements on dev, test, and prod is a big no-no in that whole kind of like, if you do that, we're going to step on it with the code sort of situation. The only people who should be doing that sort of development should be doing it on their local, the devs, and they should also push it through features. And I think that if you use features, like I use features, you're very familiar with FR and FU. I've had some experience with beginning Drupal devs having problems with these two because, I don't know about you, but revert and update are kind of squishy terms. They don't really sound like you're doing DB to code or code to DB. So I have like a stupid mnemonic about how FU Fs up your code. So if ever you're dealing with somebody who's trying to do use features from a Drush perspective, just remember that if you type in FU, you're taking everything the DB, putting it in your code, and that may not be what you want to do. If you allow users to modify the configuration via the UI, you're going to have a bad time. So just try not to do that. I know I breezed through that really quickly. Any questions on features type stuff before I get to the next part? Because it sounds like everybody kind of knows what they're doing there. Okay. So this is something I found out about, and I really lean on this quite a bit. So the deployment module just leans on .installs. So the purpose of this is to make it so that anything you want to do in a deployment process, you can put inside of this module and make it so it automatically clicks through it instead of having to do steps on the site proper. I've been using this in Drupal 7 for a few years now. I'm pretty comfortable with it, and I highly advise it. It's good for lots of things that features can't cover. Enabling and disabling modules, that's stuff you always do on sites by hand. Doing UI-based configuration changes, reverting features, content modifications to a certain degree. If you're doing things like batch jobs, it's a really good tactic, and again, I'll be walking you through this in a little bit. Things that are just SQL-based operations and batch jobs, yep, like I was saying. The module itself, what happens is you'll put a new file in this install.d folder in the construct I'll be showing you, and then you have a function that is like iterated off of the install, so like 7001 or 7002, that will be the name of the function. You'll put whatever code you want to put inside of that function, and then once you run the update feature on the site, you'll kick into all the installs that you have there. So just a brief code example. So here's something simple. It just disables the toolbar module by default. Right here, like this is the install right here that kicks off everything inside of this install.d folder. You'll see that there's the naming conventions of these can be pretty flexible. So that way you can kind of give yourself a quick representation of what is inside each of them. And then once you do an update, it will kind of roll out. But the only things that could be problematic about this module is that if you say have the same number here, like if you have two devs working at the same time on the same install process, but you both named it 7001, you'll end up having some sort of conflict, and the site won't run as well as you'd like it to be running. And after all this stuff, like if you do this correctly, you'll just have to tell your DevOps guy to run a drush updv on the site proper. So like, let me just jump to the demo here because I think that will make it more clear as to how the process goes. So I have here a default D7 site, nothing to crow about. Again, I just used Devil to generate some dummy articles. I have a test view over here that's, all it does is show the default articles. So let's say that the goal for this site, which is only on my local right now, let's say the goal is to push this live and make everything codified. So we have this view, very basic view, and we might make it so that we get this view, put it in code, push it up to our Git or whatever version control system we're using, and then have a method to automatically deploy this view on an external site. So, first things first, let's make a feature. And again, y'all have done this before, so this will be pretty quick. So if we go into views, all right. Oops, I'm sorry, I wanted to go into features. I'm going to create a new feature, and I'm just going to add this view to it. And I don't know about you guys, but I am a pretty big proponent about making sure the packages are follow some sort of naming convention. So I usually make it the first part being the name of the client, the name of the site, and the second part being whatever you are adding to this particular feature set. So when later on you have features of everything, you'll be able to quickly see which one falls into which category. So we have a test view here. This is going to be added right here. And we now have this view being covered within this feature. Just going to download this real quick and put it out into, extract it and put it into the features folder I have on my Drupal install. While I'm doing this, is there any questions? Is there any part of this process so far I've gone through that's seems like everybody's done it? Okay.
One thing I noticed is you create separate install files each time.
Yeah, yeah.
Versus like what I've done in the past, I just have a function inside of my install file that I just update. But that that was only one person working on the job, so it was easy for me to kind of come back and say, okay, well, this is where I was at, so now I'll just update that,
Right.
that number.
Right. Yeah, and I generally did that too. I think with the deployment module, what led to this particular kind of construct is that since we used it so much, we figured out, like, you know what, we're gonna have one big Franken install file if we did it, like, just kind of kept adding to the same one.
Mm-hmm.
By making us make a new file every time, it kind of held us to a convention where it's like, well, we have to think of a name for that install file, and it's going to be a, you know, kind of a quick way of understanding what's in the guts of it, right? So, like, back to this slide over here. Where did it go? You know, I'll get to that in a second. Here we go, right here. This is the one I was thinking of. So right here, like for instance, 7001, when I was making this presentation, I just wanted to make something simple and stupid to disable the toolbar. So that's why I labeled the file as such. And you can kind of see as I've gone through these iterations now, instead of going through and being like, okay, what did developer X do that I don't know about? You can kind of just scan the file list and be like, well, you know, disabled that one, re-enabled it, so forth. So, I mean, this is, you know, it's a point of opinion too. I mean, you know, whatever works for you. If you're one developer, that could also be a perfect answer for the situation you have.
I've seen too. I think you can, if you're using your profile, I think you can use the install file in that as well.
Yeah, yeah.
If you didn't want to do the module.
Yeah, and I think I've used something similar for that in situations where it was just one big deployment, like from the get-go. I could be wrong, but if we had it rolled into the profile, it may be harder to update it incrementally as time goes on.
Mm-hmm.
So, like right now, I mean, on some of my projects, I have almost up to 100 different files because of the amount of times we use this deployment thing. So actually, I'm about to step into that too, so I can kind of show you a bit more about the logic that we use. All right, so if memory serves, we had this view set up. I believe I've added it to features. It should show up as a feature, but it's not enabled yet. Yep, so there we are. That's what I just featureized, disabled. So in this example we're doing now, I would go in to this deployment module I've made and create a new update. So I'm going to change this one around just so it can deal with the view we just created. I'm going to rename it 7003 enable test view. And then over here, I am going to, so this is the same kind of standard we have with all updates and install files. It's going to have update underscore 7003. That's the hook for it. So you have to make sure that this name is always, underscore up the module name, then update, and then the increment right there. But then, as far as what is inside of it, I am now going to add the features. Oh, actually, this is a module at this point, so I'm just going to enable it. So we get to HO test view. Enable test view. And also this comment is nice to modify because when you do these updates, you'll be able to kind of see what's going on. And it's helpful once you start having the DevOps do the deployments because they can kind of see in the logs what was turned on or what wasn't turned on. So this one right here, we got the new update, enable test view, it enables the module, and then all I have to do here is run a drush updb. And you can see right there, it says enable test view. I'm going to say yes. And the deployment has happened. And if I go over to the feature, if this didn't mess up, it should say enabled. there we go. So those steps have made it so that all we had to do is run this drush up DB in order to deploy the view that we created on our local. And the one step I didn't do here is commit this via any sort of version control system you have. But once you push it up, in theory, whoever's doing your DevOps should be able to pull in and run drush up, and then there you go. That was a really simple example, obviously. But where it gets fun with these install files is that you can really do anything you want to do in the guts of it. Some of the more complex stuff, I mean, like just major batch jobs that have, affected thousands of nodes on deployment. It's just the world's your lobster when it comes to what's in the guts of this thing. I can't think of any situations in D7, honestly, that I had to manually do anything on a production site between using features and this module, unless it's content. Content's always the big thing because you can theoretically jerry-rig something to pull into CSV and maybe add things, but in general, I find that the content editors want more jurisdiction over their content, and it's really kind of hard to automate that from like a non-production environment all the way up, unless they're set on knowing exactly what they want content-wise on the lower levels. So, any questions on this part so far? This is kind of wrapping up the D7 aspect of what I wanted to talk about today. Okay, cool. All right, so let's move on to D8. Now, given my life, trying to automate things in D7 when D8 came out with configuration management, I was probably like you guys, really psyched. I don't know if you got disheartened at all at first. I did, but there was a lot of things I found out along the way, and a lot of things that have been done in the community to improve the kind of status quo. So who's used configuration management in D8 before? Everybody? Okay. So when you all use the configuration management process, are you just doing like sims and sexes and just kind of pulling things in and out? Is there anything in particular that you guys have problems with? Maybe different environments? No?
Config split things.
Okay, conflicts mostly? Yeah.
Config
Yeah.
split,
So I'll touch a little bit on that. I definitely understand that, especially if you have depending on how many developers you have. Yeah. Well, the one thing I'll be talking about in this session is config split, and I think that answers a lot of questions for dealing with individual devs, especially when it comes to local aspects. And maybe you may already know some of this stuff, and if so, then we can discuss it, because I thought I think it's a pretty good way of dealing with most problems you have with multiple developers. Yeah, so since going to config management, I've rarely used features in any significant way, just because I feel like config management covers most, if not all, things I've needed to deal with. And for better or for worse, configuration management is excellent at taking a snapshot of everything that's going on. So it's a blessing and a curse, because sometimes you're like, hey, I want that and that and that and that, but not that and that. And dealing with that is most of the time you spend, I feel, trying to mitigate the problems of configuration management. But again, the bright side is you do track the changes when you do the commit, so you can kind of sense when there's something amiss, because one developer will stomp on a YAML file you committed, or you can just kind of look at the Git history and see what happened. So, if you're doing it the way that I do it, you pull in a fairly new version of the DB, or at least one that the configuration is going to be the same across all environments. You obviously don't want to have an outdated DB when you do it, because if you do, you could end up with bad config or old config, which is bad config. And then once you have the production DB in your environment, you make your changes locally, you export what you have done, and then you commit the YAMLs that are generated, and then eventually they'll get pulled in via CI or whatever process you have that pulls it to the servers. But as I was saying before, that one of the biggest problems is when you have environment-specific variables, things on your local, things that you pulled in through production that you don't want to have going through dev or test. So management of that, I found, is pretty well modulated by config split. it's one of those things where before it existed in a kind of fairly mature state, it was really hard to do this without having a lot of manual YAML entries. But like, again, when we're dealing with local environments, I feel like it's a good thing to lean on. So in order to config split, the one thing in D8 I've been getting used to is committing and pushing settings PHP and having all of your changes for your locals in locals PHP. If I don't know if anybody's still resisting committing settings PHP in D8, I kind of advise it, but I guess it's every man for himself or one for herself. But if you do this and you have the false, if you set your config variables to false for all of the config split options, you make it so that pushing your YAMLs to different environments will be using one source of record, which would be the sync folder. And then you can add stuff within your settings local that differ from that if you wanted specific config to be pulled in locally. So like here you just say everything's false, and then on your local settings you'd be like, well, my local settings should be set to true.
And that'd be I guess, for each environment. So you'd have dev equals true, stage equals true.
Exactly, yep. And then when you start dealing with that, and I'll show this in the demo in a second, but once you start doing that, you can config what dev and test should look like on your local, and then commit those YAML files to separate folders, and then those get pushed up. So the variants on config split, usually it's CIM or CEX for general drush config management, but the CS is for split. And once you get used to it, I think that in the recent version of drush, you can use like plain old CIM or CEX, even if you have config split installed, but this is kind of a safe way of making sure that the configs are still held separately. And much like I was complaining about before, I had to think of a goofy mnemonic to make sure I didn't use the wrong term, and this is what I came up with, which is just horrible. Just forget that. All right, so what do you tell your DevOps folks? Then it's easy as running a plain old sim. They don't even have to use config split, because if you've configured it correctly, all of the stuff that matters in all of the environments is going to be on inside the plain old sync folder and not any sort of specific environment-specific folder. It will just run the import and kick out all the changes. So without further ado here, oops. So let me go to my little dummy D8 instance here. And I'm hoping we have plenty of time to share horror stories and things that went wrong and specific situations where you're just like, I wish that there was some way to automate this instead of doing it by hand. Okay, so here's my test site. I'm going to jump straight to config split because that seems to make the most sense here. Let me just go to... So in prep for this, I set up 3 specific kind of sorts of settings: the dev, test, and local. If you remember that settings PHP, setting like local PHP thing I showed before, since I told the settings local PHP to keep my local instance active, it shows up here, but the other ones are inactive. And if we go to the settings right here, I mean, this is pretty key, because if you do this and make sure it bubbles up, through all your environments, then you'll never have a situation where you're surprised to see that there's config showing up that where it shouldn't be. And in the really basic sort of example for one's local environment, I added Devil to this kind of blacklist. They now call it complete split. So for obvious reasons, no one wants Devil on any environment except for their local or maybe dev. So by doing this, I say, hey, config management, anything that's related to Devil, put the configuration within my local folder for settings, and it looks like this. So here's all those zillions of YAMLs you get when you do config management. But you'll see that local now has this subset that just deals with the things that are involving devel. And you can kind of like play with it a bit, and you can copy these between environments and make it easy to kind of navigate that way. And you can also do conditional splits. That these ones are like, honestly, I mostly use the blacklist just because that stuff it seems like it holds the most weight for me. But I also start doing things like manually, like for instance, if you go in the sync folder, let's just say for some reason you wanted to name this is a common scenario actually. If you have a dev instance or something, you want to make sure you're on dev, you have some visual representation while you're surfing the site that you're like, I'm not on prod right now, that you may want to rename this something else, then you can kind of add the site YAML to the local folder. It should import it with priority. So let's see here. I'm going to try address sim one. I'm going to change this local one to just local. Successfully imported. So if I go over to the system area, actually if I just go to the home page, it should show me the site name. So you can see here it's now local D8, and that's for moving this particular file over. Now, in my experience, I've found using this sort of setup is really key when you deal with things involving like external calls, APIs, like things that, or email, mail configurations per server. Like if you want to nerf your settings on your local, or make sure that you're not like going to spam a bunch of people. Like you can have your YAMLs that deal with that sort of like either your POP3 servers or whatever. You can enter that information in here and make sure that it doesn't actually bubble up to dev or test or whatever. But yeah, I found that this is a good way to split things up. And you can make the local stuff, you don't have to commit the local YAMLs, you can just have them exist on your local as it should be, and make it so that every developer can have their own kind of take on it. I'm trying to think, I think that may cover most of my experience there.
By adding that site YAML file into your local, did that update your config split settings in the UI?
I don't think so. I think that was more kind of a jury rig right there. But you can do that explicitly too by going through here and finding it.
I was gonna say, yeah, that seems like that would cause confusion if it didn't update in there.
Yeah. So saving this is probably, more sensible way.
So now would it conflict if you did a sexport?
Let's see.
That just sounds wrong.
Yeah, I know.
They changed it because it used to be drush FU all, right?
Yeah. The FUA is definitely it's a mnemonic I have there too. I think at this point.
I left it at FU all. It was just fun to type.
Okay, so we had successfully exported there, and then we sync this up. No surprise that this is untouched because this is exactly what it used to say. And if all went well here, we shouldn't see system site being affected. Although, yeah, we didn't change it over there. We just, it's still a test. So.
Okay, good, yeah.
All right. So that's kind of the high level overview of things that I've done in my experience with deployments. The other best practice things, honestly, these are kind of things you just do as a Drupal dev, like trying to be pretty sure that you have a new version of the database as much as humanly possible. You know, I probably run this command more often than not, especially in the world of configuration management and things of that ilk, because you could find yourself, you know, sending a bunch of bad config up the servers, and that's never fun for anybody. And if I had time for another session, which honestly, since I've been so fast, I probably could have done too, migrate is a huge help that for anything that I didn't cover from these modules I just described or these kind of solutions I've described. I've been using migrate pretty extensively with D7 and D8, and you know, even in a situation where it's not just a one-off and people want to do like periodic content updates or like have a source of record they want to throw on a Drupal site, I mean, I just lean on the migrate API a lot of the time. But yeah, that's for a whole nother session. I think that's about it. Just wanted to give a shout out to my friend here who, he kind of helped me develop most of these concepts, and I tried to bring him here to Asheville. He lives in Austin, Texas, but he just couldn't make it out there. There's too many tacos to eat or something. So, but that's the whole of it. Any questions or any kind of like situations, stories, just, you know, good or bad or otherwise, as far as, you know, what you're looking for in a deployment solution, or?
Config split with multi-site.
Yes.
I guess that's just your local dev and everything is inside that site folder that's in your config.
Yeah, so that would be a really hairy thing. I won't.
You would recommend that?
I haven't done it. I haven't done a multi-site with a config management situation before. I could envision it, but I just haven't done it.
Yeah, I'm reluctant to set that up because I don't want it to affect the other two sites that are in production.
Right.
And I'm in development of one sub-site, you know, so it's like, but I'm tired of disabling and enabling Drush every time, or Devel every time I, you know, want to deploy a change.
Right.
And honestly, I'm scared, you know, it's going to slip in. If not for me, like maybe a developer, but.
Right. I mean, that's also a core problem, right? It's like you're only as good as your weakest link when it comes to people adhering to these systems. Like if you have somebody who doesn't care about keeping track or just got lazy or something, then it kind of throws everything out the window a bit. But I honestly haven't dealt with config management in regards to multi-site. Have you, like when you do exports, do they break it out, the YAMLs break out per site at all, or is it something you
It
have to
does. It seems like it should work because, I mean, there is a top level config in the doc root that, you know, inside that, instead of having, I mean, I guess there's config and then sync, and then maybe it breaks out into each instance.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's like config and then each instance, and then inside there's a sync folder.
That's what I would hope, yeah.
And then, so I guess what I'm hoping is that inside that multi-site, or that site's folder, you would have room for local and
Yeah. I mean, you know, venturing to guess, it sounds like something that could be configured. I mean, it sounds like something you would just add as some sort of variable in your settings per whatever situation you're in, and then kind of break it out that way. That'd be kind of fun to try.
Right, aren't you set in the settings.php anyway? Aren't you putting in kind of that path for configs?
Right, yeah. So yeah, and if you're doing a multi-site situation, maybe you can break it out even farther than that sort of scenario. So yeah, I mean, I'm curious about that. That'd be an interesting thing to do.
Oh, I see. It's just actually referencing.
Yeah, these are just for the, yeah. But like in your situation with your sites, I figured it'd be just like another set up here saying something like, you know, site 1 or something. But yeah, I really, you know, I've been kind of blessed in that I haven't had a lot of multi-site configurations. You know, I guess people, you know, it's, if you have a situation like it, it fits the bill, but generally I don't do that. Yeah. Anything else? Otherwise, I think we're just a little bit early, but that's fine. I'd like to thank you all. This is the first time I did this, and I'm scared. Thank you for that.
So do you use features at all anymore?
Do I use them? Oh, yeah.
With Drupal 8?
Oh, with Drupal 8? No, I haven't had a need to, which is great, because honestly, I kind of hate them. You know, I mean, they do the job, but I mean, they were like the only port in a very horrible, like the worst storm ever. So you just kind of have to go with it.
Right.
Well, features were never designed for config.
Yeah.
Supposedly now you can use the feature module for what it was originally designed
Yeah,
for,
right.
was actually features of functionality, right?
Right. Yeah.
But I still don't know anyone that uses them for that, really.
Yeah. No, I have never had cause to yet, and hopefully, yeah, never will. But
What's your thought about custom code inside of a feature?
oh, I've had to do it sometimes. I mean, you know, it's not. It depends on where you put it and what it's used for. Sometimes I don't feel too icky because it is like at the heart of it all, a feature is a module-ish.
Uh-huh.
So like if you need to supplement something that you're pushing in a feature and you can't really lock it in otherwise, it makes sense. Like I've had that problem before with this exact sort of setup. Like it'd be like, do I make another deployment file in order to do this thing or provide this piece of functionality, or do I just roll it into the feature and just kind of throw it in there? And I chose the latter, and I didn't have too much shame about it, especially because it is code, it is trackable, and other devs can see what I did without wondering
I
where
would
the
say
heck
it's not really standard though. I've taken over a site recently where I'm like, where the heck is all this stuff? Oh, they've written into the features module file, which should be blank.
Well, yeah. No,
Like,
you do an
how hard
ink
is
or
it to
something,
really
right?
Produce your own feature, your own module, custom module, name it, and
Well, do
Now,
tell.
it's sort of like, now if it's super related to the feature, yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
But I would say, keep it out of the feature module because no one goes looking for it. That was the first time I'd seen someone do it. I'm like, why did you do that? And it's not like a small amount.
Yeah.
There's a huge amount of alters in it, and I'm like, none of these actually belong in this feature. But instead of creating a new module, a new custom module, and sticking it in there where you can find it,
Right.
they hid it in one of like the 50 features that they have.
So what? And was it pertinent to the feature, or was it just
No.
like it was just I'm going to put it there because it works?
It's just
Like,
a shortcut way. You didn't have to build a new module to do it. Like, that's just trivial, honestly.
But what's crazy is that it's almost like features accepts that though, because you can actually export your feature and it won't overwrite whatever custom code you have in there. So it's
Yeah, well, it's not supposed to use the
Like
module
a-
file, right?
yeah, not the my
safe or
yeah.
something.
Yeah, you can. I forget when I've done it, and I think I've addended to it. I like had an ink or something that I attached to it. And again, yeah, it's not like something you want to do most of the time, if ever. But yeah, it made sense to me at the time. I would love to look up the code that I added to the feature to see like why did I do that? Because generally I don't add it for no reason. But
Well, I did it one time just because it was, well, 2 times really, I guess. So the section of the site was kind of contained within one feature, and then within that one feature there were sub-features, and
wow,
it wasn't exactly my paradigm, but it was kind of like what I inherited.
yeah,
And then, but yeah, there was a lot of custom code in there, so kind of just left it there and kind of had to add things to it, but
yeah. I know that feeling too. So either I reinvent this or that. Yeah. Yeah, and if I had more time and more effort into this too, I probably would have gone through the Jenkins setups I've integrated with this too. Because again, it isn't too hard to add what I've shown inside of a Jenkins build process, but it really does make it so that once you roll it in, you can kind of track what's happened on the site pretty easily, or at least work with the DevOps guy and be like, what went wrong, and they can just show you the log and you can figure out what happened. So all right, well, thank you all very much for attending. I appreciate it.